The crystal chandeliers of the Sterling estate hung like frozen tears over a room filled with people who had never known a day of hunger. I stood by the marble pillars, my heart heavy as I watched the scene unfold. It was the night of the grand gala, an event designed to flaunt the family's massive wealth to the world. Amidst the shimmering silk gowns and the sharp tuxedos, there was Caedmon. Everyone called him the servant, but to me, he was just a young boy carrying a weight no child should ever bear. I watched as Caedmon moved through the crowd, his small hands trembling slightly as he held a heavy silver tray. He was forced to fetch drinks and clean up after the real heirs, the billionaire's biological children who acted as if the ground they walked on was made of gold. Stellan, the oldest and most arrogant of the siblings, laughed loudly as he purposely bumped into Caedmon. I saw the moment it happened. A glass slipped from Caedmon's hands. The sound of shattering crystal was like a gunshot in the silent room. Laughter erupted instantly. It wasn't just a small chuckle, it was a wave of mockery that filled the hall. The billionaire family stood there, flaunting their diamonds and their power while they belittled a boy who had nothing. They called him useless, a clumsy mistake, and a waste of space. I felt the raw humiliation radiating from Caedmon as he knelt on the cold floor to pick up the shards. My name is Mirelle, and though I appeared to be just another witness to the family's cruelty, I was secretly documenting every single insult. I looked into Caedmon's eyes and saw a kindness that none of the others possessed. It made my blood boil to see him treated this way. The family treated him like a servant, but they had no idea that I was watching. I made a silent vow right then and there. This boy would not stay invisible forever. The injustice was too deep, the cruelty too sharp. I began to write down the names, the times, and the words they used to hurt him. This gala was supposed to be their night of glory, but for me, it was the start of a very long paper trail that would lead to their downfall. The morning after the gala was quiet, but the air in the estate felt heavy with the leftovers of the family's arrogance. Caedmon was already awake, tasked with cleaning the library before the sun was even fully up. I found him there, moving a heavy duster across the mahogany shelves. His face was pale, and he still looked shaken from the previous night's embarrassment. I stayed back, watching him work with a quiet dignity that his masters could never hope to understand. As he reached for a high shelf, his hand brushed against a loose wood panel. Out of curiosity, he pulled at it, and a small, leather-bound notebook tumbled out. It was old, the edges frayed and the leather cracked with age. I saw Caedmon's eyes widen as he recognized the handwriting on the inside cover. It belonged to the patriarch, the man who built this entire empire. This wasn't just some forgotten ledger. It was a personal record of thoughts and secrets. Caedmon sat on the floor, hidden behind a large armchair, and began to read. I watched from the doorway as his expression shifted from curiosity to utter shock. The notebook contained entries that hinted at a past the family had tried desperately to bury. It mentioned a child, a legacy, and a truth that didn't align with the stories the siblings told. It suggested that Caedmon wasn't just a random orphan taken in out of charity. A spark of hope flickered in his eyes for the first time since I had known him. He gripped the notebook tightly to his chest, as if it were a shield. He wasn't just another servant boy. There was a reason he was in this house, and there was a reason they treated him so poorly. They weren't just mean, they were afraid. I realized then that the notebook was the first piece of a much larger puzzle. Caedmon tucked the book inside his shirt, his posture slightly straighter than it had been minutes ago. The game was beginning to change. Suspicion is a powerful thing, and Caedmon was starting to use it as a tool. A few days after finding the notebook, he was assigned to clean the hallway outside the main dining room. The siblings were inside, their voices rising in a heated argument that they thought no one could hear. Caedmon stayed low, his cloth moving rhythmically against the baseboards, but his ears were focused entirely on the conversation behind the closed doors. I was nearby, pretending to organize some linens, so I heard the voices too. Stellan's voice was the loudest, sharp, and full of greed. He was bragging to his siblings about how he would control everything once the final legalities were settled. Then, the mood shifted. One of the sisters mentioned something that made my heart stop: the mistaken will. They were arguing about documents that shouldn't exist and a boy who shouldn't be there. "If that boy isn't recognized, the entire estate stays with us," Stellan hissed. "We just have to keep him in his place until the paperwork is finalized." The siblings were actively plotting to keep Caedmon in the dark about his own life. They knew exactly who he was, and they were terrified of what would happen if the truth ever came out. Every word they spoke confirmed the hints Caedmon had found in the patriarch's notebook. Caedmon didn't flinch. He didn't drop his cloth or make a sound. He simply listened, soaking in the evidence of their betrayal. I could see the wheels turning in his mind. He was no longer just a victim of their bullying. He was a witness to their crimes. The siblings thought they were the ones in control, but by speaking so freely, they had handed Caedmon the very information he needed to start fighting back. He finished his cleaning and walked away, his face a mask of calm. For a long time, I had watched Caedmon from the shadows, but I knew that for him to truly succeed, he needed an ally. He was smart, but he was just a boy against a family of wolves. I found him in the gardens late one evening, sitting by the stone fountain where the shadows were deepest. He looked lonely, the weight of his secrets pressing down on him. I approached him cautiously, making sure my footsteps were audible so I wouldn't startle him. "Caedmon," I said softly. He jumped, his eyes darting to his shirt where I knew he had hidden the patriarch's notebook. I held up my hands to show I wasn't a threat. "I've seen how they treat you. It's not right, and I know you've found something." He was wary at first, his body tense and ready to run. He had been burned by everyone in this house, so why should he trust me? I told him my name was Mirelle, and that I had been documenting the family's injustices for a long time. I explained that I didn't want their money. I wanted justice for what they had done to him. We talked for a long time under the moonlight. I offered him my protection and my advice on how to navigate the dangerous waters of the Sterling family. I told him that if we worked together, we could find the proof he needed to change his life forever. Slowly, the tension left his shoulders. He looked at me, really looked at me, and I saw a flicker of trust. He realized he didn't have to carry this burden alone anymore. We formed a quiet alliance that night, a bond built on shared secrets and a mutual desire for the truth. I promised him that he would no longer stay invisible. From that moment on, Caedmon had eyes and ears everywhere in the estate. He wasn't just a servant anymore. He was a silent partner in a plan for redemption. With our alliance formed, we began to look for more concrete evidence. Caedmon remembered a specific corner of the vast library that the siblings rarely visited, a section filled with old legal texts and family history. While the family was out at another social function, he slipped into the room. I kept watch at the door, my heart racing every time I heard a floorboard creak in the distance. Caedmon searched the shelves with a focused intensity. He wasn't just looking for books, he was looking for anything out of place. Finally, tucked behind a thick volume of property laws, he found it, a sealed letter. The envelope was yellowed with age, but the wax seal was still intact. It was addressed directly to him in the patriarch's unmistakable, bold handwriting. His hands shook as he broke the seal. The letter was a revelation. In it, the patriarch spoke of his true parentage and his rightful place in the family. It explicitly stated that Caedmon was the only legal heir to the entire Sterling fortune. The patriarch had known the other siblings were greedy and manipulative, and he had intended for Caedmon to be the one to carry on the legacy. It was the ultimate proof, the smoking gun we had been looking for. Caedmon read the letter twice, his breath hitching in his chest. Everything changed in that moment. He wasn't just a boy who might be important. He was the person who owned the very roof over their heads. The letter mentioned that more documents were hidden throughout the house, ensuring that even if one was found and destroyed, the truth would survive. We knew we had to be careful. If the siblings found this letter, they would burn it in a heartbeat. Caedmon tucked the letter into a secret pocket I had sewn into his vest, his eyes burning with a new kind of determination. The siblings, sensing that Caedmon was becoming less reactive to their taunts, decided to escalate their cruelty. They organized a high-profile charity event at the estate, inviting the city's elite to show off their generosity. To humiliate Caedmon, they forced him to work the entire event as a busboy, making sure he was seen by everyone in his stained apron and worn-out shoes. They wanted to remind him, and the world, that he was nothing more than a servant. I watched from the sidelines, ready to intervene if things got too dangerous. Stellan and his sisters took every opportunity to bark orders at him, making him carry heavy trays of hors d'oeuvres through the crowded ballroom. They tripped him, mocked his appearance, and laughed when he had to scrub a spill off a guest's expensive gown. They expected him to break, to cry, or to lash out in anger. That was their plan, to make him look unstable in front of the guests. But Caedmon had changed. He remembered the letter in his pocket and the truth of who he really was. Instead of showing hurt, he remained perfectly composed. He moved with a grace that made the siblings look like the ones who were out of place. He answered every insult with a polite, "Yes, sir," or "Of course, ma'am," his voice steady and calm. His dignity was a shield that their barbs couldn't pierce. I saw the confusion on the faces of the guests. They saw a hard-working, polite boy being treated like dirt by a family that claimed to be charitable. The siblings' plan was backfiring. Instead of making Caedmon look small, they were making themselves look like monsters. Even some of the other adults in the room began to give the siblings side-eye glances. Caedmon's moral integrity was becoming his greatest leverage, and for the first time, the power dynamic in the house was starting to shift. While the family was distracted by their own social climbing, Caedmon continued his quiet investigation. He knew that the patriarch wouldn't have just left a letter. There had to be more evidence of the siblings' wrongdoings. One afternoon, while he was assigned to dust the high shelves in the family's private study, he discovered a set of accounting books that didn't match the public records. He brought the books to a small crawl space we used as a meeting spot. As we flipped through the pages, the magnitude of the siblings' greed became clear. They hadn't just been mean, they had been stealing. Each entry revealed a trail of embezzlement, where funds meant for the estate and charity were being funneled into private accounts. They were bleeding the patriarch's legacy dry to fund their own lavish lifestyles. "Every entry is a weapon," Caedmon whispered, his eyes scanning the columns of numbers. He was right. This wasn't just about his inheritance anymore. It was about the illegal actions the siblings had taken to secure their own power. They had built their entire lives on a foundation of lies and theft. This information gave us a huge advantage. It wasn't just his word against theirs, it was documented financial fraud. We spent hours transcribing the most damning entries. I taught Caedmon how to look for patterns and how to cross-reference the dates with the family's major purchases. The more we found, the more we realized how desperate the siblings would be to keep this hidden. They weren't just protecting their pride, they were protecting their freedom. Caedmon realized that he held their entire future in his hands, and the weight of that responsibility made him even more careful. He was no longer just a boy, he was a strategist. Stellan, frustrated by Caedmon's newfound composure, decided to try a more direct approach. He and his siblings staged a rigged accident in the main foyer. They loosened a heavy rug on the marble stairs and placed a delicate, expensive vase on a pedestal right in the path where Caedmon usually walked with the morning mail. They hoped he would slip, break the vase, and give them a reason to finally kick him out of the house. I saw them whispering and giggling near the top of the stairs, waiting for the show to begin. Caedmon approached the stairs, but he had become incredibly observant. He noticed the slight bunching of the rug and the way Stellan was staring too intensely from the balcony. Instead of walking into the trap, Caedmon stopped. He reached down, straightened the rug with a calm hand, and then walked around the pedestal, never once losing his balance. The siblings' faces fell. Their plan had failed completely, and it had made them look foolish. But Caedmon didn't stop there. He looked up at Stellan and gave a polite, almost knowing nod. The household staff, who had been watching the scene from the shadows, couldn't help but feel a surge of respect for the boy. They had seen the trap too, and they saw how easily Caedmon had avoided it. This small victory earned Caedmon the subtle admiration of the servants and staff. They began to see that he wasn't just a victim. He was someone who could outsmart the people who bullied them every day. Loyalties were starting to shift. The kitchen staff started giving him extra portions of food, and the estate manager stopped barking orders at him. Caedmon was gaining allies in plain sight, and the siblings were losing their grip on the household they thought they controlled. The Sterling estate was full of secrets, and some of them were built into the very walls. While cleaning a dusty corner of the basement, Caedmon noticed a draft coming from behind a heavy tapestry. When he moved it, he found a small, iron-bound door that led to a narrow, spiraling stone staircase. It was a hidden passage, one that wasn't on any of the official blueprints of the house. Heart-pounding, Caedmon climbed the stairs. They were narrow and smelled of old paper and wax. He followed them all the way to the top, where he found himself behind a trick bookshelf. He pushed it slightly and realized he was looking directly into the patriarch's private office, a room that had been locked and off-limits since the old man's passing. This was the inner sanctum, the place where the most important decisions had been made. This forbidden access became Caedmon's greatest strategic advantage. From this vantage point, he could listen to the siblings' private meetings without them ever knowing he was there. He could see the documents they left on the desk and the maps they used to plan their next moves. He was like a ghost in the house, moving through the walls and gathering intelligence that no one else could reach. He spent hours in the passage, documenting everything he saw and heard. He learned about their secret offshore accounts and their plans to sell off parts of the estate once they had full control. The hidden staircase wasn't just a way to move around, it was a window into the dark heart of the family. Caedmon felt a strange sense of connection to the patriarch in that office, as if the old man had left these paths specifically for him to find. He was no longer just an outsider. He was becoming the true master of the house. One night, while the rest of the house was asleep, Caedmon used the hidden passage to enter the patriarch's office. He knew there was more to find in that room. He searched the desk, his fingers tracing the wood until he found a hidden drawer. Inside, wrapped in silk, was the patriarch's personal diary, the one he had used in his final months. As Caedmon read the last few entries, emotions flooded over him: shock, disbelief, and then a cold, hard determination. The diary didn't just hint at the truth, it confirmed everything. The patriarch wrote about his deep love for Caedmon and his disgust with his other children's behavior. He explicitly stated that Caedmon was his only legal heir, and that he had set up a series of protections to ensure the boy would eventually take his rightful place. "I leave everything to the one who has shown the most heart," the entry read. Caedmon sat in the patriarch's large leather chair, the weight of the legacy finally hitting him. He wasn't just a servant who got lucky, he was the chosen one. He felt a profound sense of sadness for the man who had died surrounded by greedy vultures, but he also felt a new sense of purpose. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore, he was fighting to honor the patriarch's true wishes. He carefully replaced the diary, but took with him the knowledge that he was the rightful owner of everything he saw. The shock of the discovery began to settle into a calm. Focused energy, he knew he couldn't act yet, he needed to be patient. But the disbelief was gone. He knew exactly who he was, and he knew that the siblings were living on borrowed time. He slipped back through the hidden passage, a billionaire in everything but name. Caedmon knew that to win the final battle, he needed to start winning smaller ones. He began to use the information he had gathered to chip away at the siblings' authority. One afternoon, he noticed Stellan's younger brother, Julian, taking a valuable gold watch from a display case in the parlor, clearly intending to sell it to pay off a gambling debt. Instead of going to the family, Caedmon went to the household staff. He quietly mentioned to the head housekeeper that he had seen Julian cleaning the watch near his private quarters. When the watch inevitably went missing from the case, the staff already knew where to look. They found it hidden in Julian's room, and for the first time, the perfect heirs were caught in a lie by the very people they looked down upon. This was a small victory, but it was a significant one. By exposing a minor theft by the spoiled heirs to the household staff, Caedmon was quietly gaining their loyalty. The staff began to see that the siblings were not just arrogant, but also dishonest. They started to look to Caedmon as someone who actually cared about the integrity of the house. He was using subtle manipulation, not to be cruel, but to reveal the truth. I watched as the atmosphere in the kitchen and the servants' quarters changed. People started whispering about Caedmon's cleverness. They began to protect him, hiding his mistakes and giving him heads up when the siblings were in a bad mood. Caedmon was building a network of allies from the ground up, and the siblings were too busy fighting among themselves to notice the ground shifting beneath them. Every small victory was a brick in the wall he was building around the family's lies. The siblings weren't completely oblivious. They began to notice that Caedmon was no longer the shrinking, fearful boy he used to be. He looked them in the eye, and he always seemed to be in the right place at the right time. Stellan, in particular, became suspicious. One evening, he caught Caedmon coming out of a hallway near the patriarch's office, a part of the house he was strictly forbidden to enter. "What were you doing there, servant?" Stellan hissed, pinning Caedmon against the wall. His sisters stood behind him, their faces twisted in sneers. They threatened him with immediate termination and promised to make sure he ended up on the streets with nothing. They tried to use the same old fear that had worked for years, but this time it didn't work. Caedmon didn't flinch. He didn't apologize or beg for mercy. He simply looked at Stellan with a calm, steady gaze that signaled he was no longer afraid. "I was just doing my job, sir," he said, his voice completely level. "The house has many secrets, and I'm just learning how to navigate them." The hidden meaning in his words wasn't lost on them. It was a bluff, but a powerful one. The siblings were taken aback by his refusal to be intimidated. They could feel that something had changed, but they couldn't figure out what it was. Their threats felt hollow against his quiet confidence. Stellan eventually let him go, but the tension in the house was now at a breaking point. Caedmon had signaled that he was a player in their game, and they knew they had to be more careful. The hunter was becoming the hunted, and the siblings were starting to feel the pressure. As the tension grew, our small circle of allies expanded. It wasn't just me and the kitchen staff anymore. Caedmon had managed to gain the loyalty of key staff members, including the estate manager, Mr. Henderson, who had served the patriarch for 30 years. Mr. Henderson had always suspected that something was wrong with the will, but he had been too afraid to speak up until he saw Caedmon's bravery. We began to meet secretly in the estate manager's office, away from the prying eyes of the siblings. Mr. Henderson provided us with access to legal documents and family history that we hadn't been able to find on our own. He also knew the names of the lawyers and executors who had been involved in the patriarch's affairs. Together, we began to plan carefully for the big reveal. "We have to time this perfectly," Mr. Henderson said, his voice low and serious. "If we move too early, they'll find a way to bury the evidence. We need to wait for the next gala when everyone is watching." I agreed. We needed the maximum amount of witnesses to ensure the siblings couldn't lie their way out of it. We were building a case that was airtight, with documents, witness testimony, and financial records. Caedmon was the center of it all. He was the one who had to stay calm and play the part of the servant until the very last moment. I watched him during those meetings, and I was amazed by his growth. He was no longer just a boy looking for a way out. He was a leader preparing for a revolution. We were a small group, but we were united by a common goal: justice for the boy who had been treated like a servant in his own home. The siblings, feeling the walls closing in, tried one last desperate attempt to ruin Caedmon's reputation. They planned a public prank during a smaller garden gala, hoping to make him look like a thief or a fool in front of the local dignitaries. They hid a piece of expensive jewelry in his apron, and then discovered it missing, intending to call the police and have him arrested on the spot. But Caedmon was one step ahead of them. He had seen them whispering near his laundry and had already found the jewelry. Instead of panicking, he waited for the right moment. When Stellan made a big show of announcing that a diamond necklace was missing, Caedmon stepped forward with a polite smile. He didn't just return it. He claimed he had found it dropped near Julian's coat and was just about to turn it in to the estate manager. The heir's attempt at a public prank was deflected gracefully. Instead of Caedmon being the thief, the suspicion was once again cast back onto the siblings. The guests watched as the spoiled heirs scrambled to explain how the necklace had accidentally ended up near their things. It was a laughable spectacle, and the siblings were the ones left looking embarrassed and incompetent. I could see the fury in Stellan's eyes, but I also saw something else: fear. He was realizing that every trap they set was being turned against them. Caedmon was using their own schemes to highlight their dishonesty. He was becoming a master of the very environment they thought they owned. Each failed attempt by the siblings only served to strengthen Caedmon's position and weaken theirs. The servant was winning the psychological war. One of the most important pieces of the puzzle was the family's old lawyer, Mr. Whitmore. He had been a close friend of the patriarch, but the siblings had replaced him with a more flexible firm after the patriarch's death. Caedmon managed to contact him secretly, using a burner phone I had provided. They met in a quiet park far from the estate. Mr. Whitmore was a man of integrity, and when Caedmon showed him the documents we had found, he was visibly shaken. He confirmed that the inheritance was indeed legitimate and that the patriarch's intentions were clear. He wanted Caedmon to be the sole heir. He explained how the siblings had used a forged document to temporarily seize control of the estate while Caedmon was still a minor. "I knew something was wrong," Mr. Whitmore said, his voice trembling with anger. "But they threatened me and my family. Now that you have the original documents, they can't stop the truth." He agreed to help us, providing the legal expertise we needed to make the final reveal official. He was the final piece of the alliance, giving us the legal power to back up our evidence. Caedmon felt a huge sense of relief. Having a respected lawyer on his side meant that he wasn't just a boy with some papers. He was a legal claimant with a professional advocate. He realized that the patriarch had truly loved him and had gone to great lengths to protect him, even after death. The weight of the world felt a little lighter as he walked back to the estate, knowing that the law was finally on his side. As the date of the next major gala approached, the tension in the Sterling household reached an all-time high. The siblings were no longer even pretending to be a happy family. Jealousy and paranoia were tearing them apart. They began to turn on each other, each one blaming the other for the Caedmon problem. There were screaming matches in the hallways and constant backstabbing. Stellan accused his sisters of being too soft, while they accused him of being too reckless with his pranks. Sabotage attempts became a daily occurrence, not just against Caedmon, but against each other. They were fighting for a bigger slice of an empire that was about to be taken away from them entirely. Caedmon and I watched from the sidelines as the family crumbled from within. Their entitlement and greed were their own worst enemies. They were so focused on their own power that they didn't see the real threat standing right in front of them. The house felt like a powder keg, ready to explode at the slightest spark. The toxic dynamics were on full display for everyone to see. Even the guests who came for tea or business meetings could sense the rot at the heart of the family. Caedmon remained the eye of the storm, calm, focused, and ready. He was no longer affected by their outbursts. He simply used them as further evidence of their unfitness to lead the Sterling legacy. The stage was being set for the final act of this drama. With the legal support of Mr. Whitmore and the loyalty of the estate staff, Caedmon began to create a meticulous plan for unveiling the truth. This wasn't just about a reveal, it was about a complete takeover. We spent nights in the estate manager's office, going over every detail of the upcoming gala. "Timing is everything," Caedmon said, his voice firm and filled with a new authority. "We need to wait for the moment when the most influential people are present. We need to make sure the media is there to capture their reactions." He was no longer just thinking like a victim, he was thinking like a CEO. He understood that to truly defeat them, he had to win the battle of public opinion as well as the legal one. We assigned roles to everyone in our alliance. I would be responsible for documenting the event and ensuring the evidence was presented clearly. Mr. Henderson would manage the staff to ensure the siblings couldn't interfere. Mr. Whitmore would handle the legal proceedings as soon as the reveal was made. It was a complex operation that required absolute secrecy and perfect execution. Patience was key. Caedmon knew that if he moved too soon, he would lose the element of surprise. He had to continue acting like the humble servant, even as he was preparing to become the master of the house. He practiced his speech, his stance, and his responses to the siblings' inevitable panic. He was ready for the fight of his life, and he knew that there was no room for error. The countdown to the final gala had begun. A few days before the gala, Caedmon discovered one final secret. While reviewing the patriarch's diary, he noticed a mention of a hidden vault in the private study. He used the hidden passage one last time to search the room. Behind a portrait of the patriarch's wife, he found a sophisticated keypad hidden in the wall. Using a code he had deciphered from the diary, he opened the vault. Inside, he found a treasure trove of evidence that exceeded even our wildest expectations. There were signed contracts, original wills, and even recordings of the siblings discussing their plans to manipulate the inheritance. It was a mountain of evidence that proved beyond any doubt that Caedmon was the rightful heir and that the siblings were criminals. "The stakes have just gone through the roof," Caedmon whispered as he looked at the documents. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about the entire Sterling empire. The siblings hadn't just stolen from him. They had tried to destroy the very foundations of the company. With these documents, he could not only claim his inheritance, but also ensure that the siblings faced real legal consequences for their actions. He carefully photographed everything and then replaced the documents, making sure everything looked exactly as it had before. He didn't want to tip them off that he had found the final piece of the puzzle. The vault was his ultimate insurance policy. As he slipped back into the hidden passage, he felt a surge of confidence. He had everything he needed. The trap was set, and the siblings were about to walk right into it. The night before the gala was the longest of Caedmon's life. He couldn't sleep, so he spent the hours reviewing every detail of his plan one last time. He sat in his small, cramped room, the same room where he had spent so many nights feeling alone and worthless. He wrote down every step, every person he needed to talk to, and every possible reaction the siblings might have. He felt a mix of fear and anticipation. He knew that by the next night, his life would be changed forever. He would either be the head of the Sterling estate or he would be out on the streets. But for the first time, the fear didn't paralyze him. It fueled him. He thought about the patriarch, about the kindness he had seen in the old man's eyes, and about the justice that had been delayed for so long. No slip-ups, he told himself, his voice a low whisper. He checked the hidden pocket in his vest, making sure the key documents were secure. He looked at the burner phone, waiting for the signal from Mr. Whitmore. Everything was in place. He had done the work, he had found the allies, and he had kept his dignity through it all. As the sun began to rise on the day of the gala, Caedmon took a deep breath. He looked at his reflection in the small, cracked mirror and saw a person he finally recognized, a young man who was ready to claim his destiny. The time for hiding was over. The boy they treated like a servant was about to become the man who owned it all. The night of the grand gala arrived. The Sterling estate was once again filled with the elite of the city, the air thick with the smell of expensive perfume and the sound of a string quartet. The siblings were in high spirits, flaunting their wealth and arrogance as they moved through the crowd, completely unaware that their world was about to come crashing down. I stood by the entrance, my heart hammering against my ribs. I saw Caedmon enter the ballroom. He wasn't carrying a tray this time. He was dressed in a simple but well-tailored suit that Mr. Henderson had managed to get for him. He walked with a quiet confidence that seemed to radiate from him, his eyes clear and focused. His presence was immediately unnerving to the siblings, who were used to seeing him in a servant's apron. "What are you doing here?" Stellan hissed, moving toward him with a look of pure hatred. "Get back to the kitchen before I have you thrown out." He reached out to grab Caedmon's arm, but Caedmon simply stepped aside, his gaze never wavering. The crowd began to notice the confrontation, and a hush fell over the room. Caedmon didn't say a word to Stellan. He walked straight to the center of the ballroom, where the patriarch's portrait hung. He looked up at the image of the man who had believed in him, and then he turned to face the crowd. His silence was more powerful than any shout. The siblings were frozen in confusion and anger, but the rest of the room was captivated by the boy who was no longer acting like a servant. The moment had finally arrived. With the eyes of the city's elite upon him, Caedmon reached into his jacket and pulled out a stack of documents, the ones he had taken from the hidden vault. He didn't just tell them the truth, he showed them the evidence. He began to read from the original will, his voice clear and steady, amplified by the microphone that Mr. Henderson had conveniently left on for the official speeches. "My name is Caedmon Sterling," he began, "and I am the only legal heir to this estate." He then began to publicly expose the siblings' illegal actions, using the documents from the vault to prove their embezzlement and their manipulation of the patriarch's wishes. He showed the guests the photographs of the accounting books and the records of their secret accounts. The crowd gasped, whispers rippled through the estate like wildfire. People who had just been laughing and drinking with the siblings now looked at them with horror and disgust. The perfect heirs were being unmasked as criminals in front of everyone they had ever tried to impress. The weight of the evidence was undeniable. I watched as Stellan and his sisters tried to interrupt, but the estate staff, led by Mr. Henderson, blocked their path. They were powerless to stop the truth from coming out. The humiliation they had once forced upon Caedmon was now being turned back on them 1,000 times over. The servant was now the one in control, and the world was watching as the siblings' empire of lies began to crumble. Panic and confusion erupted among the siblings. They scrambled to contain the fallout, shouting denials and trying to grab the documents from Caedmon's hands. But it was too late. The guests were already on their phones, calling their own lawyers and journalists. The story was out, and there was no taking it back. I saw the siblings' allies, the people who had supported them only because of their wealth and influence, start to defect. They realized that Caedmon now held the legal power and the moral high ground. No one wanted to be associated with a family of thieves and manipulators. The siblings were suddenly alone in a room full of people who had once been their friends. "This is a lie. He's just a servant," Stellan screamed, his face red with rage. But his voice was drowned out by the murmur of the crowd and the clicking of cameras. He looked around for someone to help him, but even the guards he had hired were standing still, their loyalties shifted by the overwhelming evidence. The siblings were in a state of total collapse. They were no longer the confident, arrogant heirs. They were desperate, cornered animals. Caedmon stood in the center of the chaos, his calm, dignified stance a stark contrast to their frantic attempts to retain control. He had won the battle of public opinion, and now it was time for the final blow. The power of the Sterling name was officially passing to its rightful owner. Just as the chaos seemed to reach its peak, a new sound filled the ballroom. A surprise recording, one that Caedmon had found in the vault, began to play over the gala's speakers. It was the patriarch's voice, strong, clear, and unmistakable. The entire room went silent as the old man's words echoed through the hall. "If you are hearing this," the recording began, "it means that the truth has finally been revealed. I have long known of the greed and cruelty of my biological children. I have seen how they treat those they deem beneath them." The patriarch then went on to declare Caedmon as his only rightful heir, praising his character, his resilience, and his integrity. The siblings were frozen in shock and disbelief. To hear their father's voice, from beyond the grave, condemning their actions and choosing Caedmon over them was the ultimate betrayal. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated justice. The recording was the final, irrefutable proof of Caedmon's right to the estate. Chaos erupted once more, but this time it was different. It wasn't just panic. It was a realization that the old world of the Sterling estate was gone forever. The patriarch's voice had spoken, and his word was law. Caedmon looked at the siblings, and for the first time I saw a flicker of pity in his eyes. He didn't want revenge, he wanted justice. And now he finally had it. In the days following the gala, the transition was swift and decisive. With Mr. Whitmore and Mr. Henderson by his side, Caedmon took full control of the estate. He issued formal notices of inheritance and authority, effectively stripping the siblings of their power and influence overnight. The lawyers and the courts moved quickly to finalize the paperwork, and the Sterling fortune was officially transferred to his name. The arrogant heirs were suddenly powerless. They were given a short period to pack their personal belongings and leave the estate. Without their money and their status, they were nothing. I watched as they walked out the front gates, the very gates they had used to humiliate Caedmon just weeks before. They were stripped of their entitlement and left to face the consequences of their own actions. Caedmon didn't celebrate their downfall with cruelty. He didn't mock them or rub his victory in their faces. He simply moved into the patriarch's office and began the hard work of cleaning up the mess they had left behind. He hired back the staff they had fired and began to implement a new era of fairness and integrity in the Sterling Empire. He was now the billionaire he was always meant to be, but he was also the same boy who had known the value of a kind word and a helping hand. He used his wealth to build schools, to support orphans, and to ensure that no one else would ever have to go through what he had. He had risen from the ashes of humiliation to become a beacon of hope and a true leader. The story of the little boy they treated like a servant closed on a note of deep satisfaction and moral triumph. Justice had been served, and Caedmon was finally celebrated as the rightful heir he had always been. His dignity was intact, and his future was brighter than he had ever imagined. Mirelle stood by his side as he looked out over the gardens of his new home. I had witnessed the entire journey, from the first humiliation to the final victory. I knew that his story would inspire others to never give up, no matter how hard life became. Resilience, patience, and integrity had achieved the ultimate revenge. The toxic family had crumbled under the weight of their own arrogance, and a new, better legacy was beginning. Caedmon was no longer invisible. He was a leader, a philanthropist, and a man of honor. He had turned his disadvantage into leverage and his pain into a purpose. As the sun set on the Sterling estate, I felt a sense of peace. The boy who was once called a servant was now the master of his own destiny, and I, as his narrator and friend, knew that this was just the beginning of his true story. Justice had been achieved through strategy and integrity, not cruelty, and that made the victory even sweeter.